Okay, amazing. So as Pedram introduced, this very handsome man here is Nassim Nicholas Taleb, Lebanese American author. In the 5 books, which comprises this series of books, there are a few that I'm sure you've heard of. In order, they're written Fooled by Randomness, The Black Swan, The Better Procrastinator's Anti-Fragile, and Skin in the Game. So you guys are a consultancy firm. I'm sure you have a lot of management 101 business language, which is flying around a lot. People talk about anti-fragility all the time. They talk about skin in the game all the time. They talk about the black swan all the time as well. So he writes, if you ingest the books fully, it's so compelling. It can be the type of ideas that just worm into the base of your skull and do change the sort of outlook on life, the way you think about randomness, risk, but most importantly, the way you think about serendipity, the way you think about chance, and so forth. So I'm in the first few slides going to try and explain as much as possible without the full context of his books, how it might have affected me, and then some ideas then from the books. So any Danes in the room? So this is a quote of Søren Kierkegaard, who was a Danish guy. And he wrote this well before Nassim lived, obviously, but I think it encapsulates perfectly the magnum opus of what all of Taleb's work is. That is, life can be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Taleb repurposes it as, how can we predict a future of infinite possibilities based off our finite experience of the past? So I presume most of the room is Swedish. As you were at, say, this point in your life, did you know, say 18, or before you met your partner, maybe there's some single people in the room, you haven't met the partner yet, the type of moments there that completely changed the direction that your life was going to take, are so significant and crucially, mostly completely random. And that's it's an exciting thing to think about, because as Taleb goes on to talk about, particularly with this idea of anti-fragile, you want to embrace randomness, accept randomness, and try and map it out as best you can. But as you stand here, your life today, who's to say who's to say which path you're going to take? You get a tap on the shoulder tomorrow, the dream job of your life in Nairobi has opened up. It's just for you, take it. How divergent are the paths that the life could take? And that looks into this thing, the black swan. So again, please interrupt me or give me some feedback if it's too fast or not understanding your qualifications and so forth. The Black Swan is the second book in the installment, and I'm sure you've all heard of it. Actually, has anyone heard of it?
Or I've heard that on the film, but that's nothing to do with that.
No. Perhaps you could give a quick synopsis.
No, I wouldn't do a synopsis of it. I just heard of it.
Or your understanding of it.
No, I live that too.
Okay. The notion of completely outsized, unpredictable events that obliterate and shift whatever your risk profile of a particular market, a particular population is. And I mean, try and think about this in your own work. All the different clients you work with, the different industries that they're in, the way that maybe you interact with each other or interact with them. What are these crazy outsized events that you never saw coming, that came in, completely shifted, the way that you have to look at everything? And so the point of thinking of a black swan is, what can be done about them, and how can you, they're inherently unpredictable, so you can never properly predict them exactly, but how can you become resilient to them when they eventually might come into your life? And the black swan is not just negative. You run into the salad line, the person that becomes your wife or husband. That's an outsized, high impact event that you did not see coming. You didn't prepare. You didn't try and make happen. It's completely random, but the effects on your life and then the effects on everything else are evidently clear. So I'm speaking with consultants. Let's define what a black swan is definitively. So extreme event, 9/11 is clearly one. If you were walking the streets of Manhattan on September 10th, you were completely unprepared. No one was thinking about what was going to happen the following day, and the way that shifted an entire city's culture, and then financial markets as well, but then as well, so many other things. The fact that in Arlanda, there is such strict airport security is largely consequence of an event that happened across the other side of the world that no one saw coming, right? Billions of dollars converted just like that. It's new industries into new practices because of a black swan. The Indonesian tsunami, once in a 1,000-year weather event. Sure, maybe it comes around once in 1,000 years, but it's a black swan if you can't say definitively the time and day that it's coming, because you cannot then adequately prepare for it. They have an extreme and outsized impact. Imagine if you were a Mayan in Veracruz and you see over the horizon come this vessel full of Spanish people with horses. It is an extreme, it's a not only life-changing, it changed the course of an entire continent, millions of people's futures. Great example of a black swan, completely unpredictable. They thought they were gods when they came off the ships. The invention of penicillin, a glorious Australian, Mr. Howard Florey, left his petri dish out overnight accidentally. He made a mistake. That moment of serendipity, total positive black swan, unpredictable. It was in none of the predictive models of the future that him and his team of brilliant scientists were working out. Yet the impact of penicillin, I think it's like the base of antibiotics, right? So large impact. Finally, only explicable after the fact. So crucially, 9/11, you can say, look at the rise of Islamic extremism in these countries. Surely a terrorist attack isn't coming. Oh, there were even potentially potentially some intelligence came in that said this exact event was going to happen. It's only explicable after the event. In Islam, the same thing, colonization, the election of Donald Trump. After he was elected, everyone had a good reason for why he was elected. Everyone could explain, hey, this is why Donald Trump was elected. But I don't know if you remember, but whilst it was happening, it was a joke. It was an unbelievable outcome that he could possibly get elected. And so I view that as a black swan event. Changed the direction of the largest economy in the world's culture, and the amount of, again, financial implications, the way money is rediverted when big events like that happen. Catalyst of World War I, huge black swan event, completely redirected the future of the European continent. And I should also say as well that if hopefully this all makes you interested in Nassim and his books, and then you ingest them in your own time, and you can see from him, because something about Nassim is that he's an incredibly, he's one of these sort of tail end outliers when it comes to the ability to communicate. He will neatly wrap up what I just stumbled through with a nice clean aphorism, and it makes it very understandable. So I would encourage you to read it. Now, the answer to the black swan, this maybe becomes a bit more personal. Another buzzword, another title of a book he wrote, anti-fragile, the idea of gaining from disorder. Nietzsche said, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Kanye West said, that don't kill me will only make me stronger. It's true. Think about when you go to the gym. Pedro and I were arm wrestling. He's much stronger than he looks. So he was...
None of this ever happened.
So when he goes to the gym, what's he doing? He is using an isolated exercise to do micro tears in the muscle. And every single rep you do actually hurts you physically. But then you go to sleep, you eat something, you come back, and it heals back stronger. The human vessel is a perfect example of what it is to be anti-fragile. The same can be said for education, knowledge, self-development. These are all things that make you stronger, right? By hurting a little bit, by realizing a weakness, by physically undergoing a weakness, you then become stronger. One huge important caveat to make is that enough disorder can break anything. So Nietzsche was wrong. That doesn't kill you, doesn't always make you stronger. If you're hit by a car and both your legs are taken out, you're not coming back stronger, right? So there's a threshold to disorder, and I won't talk about it here, but I think and test the room on it, but I did a podcast about antidepressants and anti-fragility, because I think they fit into this model very neatly. But if you want to talk about it, we can talk about it later, but I think it's a fascinating look at an application of anti-fragility. So embracing randomness is far less than ignoring it. If you decide to close your eyes to the world and not embrace the risk, or not at least notice the risk, you can still make it to the end. You can still lead you can get lucky. You can lead the good life, have a fulfilling job, have a loving family, have a nice standard of living. But you got lucky for that. What is better is to try to, at least as much as we can, recognize the risks and embrace the randomness so we can improve from the small hits that we get. I mean, this organization is anti-fragile. You guys just won another an award for being an amazing agency, right? So I assume you don't repeat mistakes much. If you make a mistake, the idea is that you're not going to make that mistake again. You improve from it. You become more of an anti-fragile organization because of that, and individually as well, mistakes that you might make. And all of the individuals in this organization, every time they improve a little bit, the whole organization becomes a little bit better. It's this notion of learning from mistakes, embracing the randomness. Your resilience gets a little bit bigger over time. But on the caveat, if you were to say, just make a unforgivable mistake to your biggest client, that's exceeding the caveat for the disorder. It's not. Anyway, so Taleb writes, I take risks crossing the road every day. So according to you, I should just stay home in a state of paralysis. The answer is that we don't cross the street blindfolded, because if you think about this as an analogy for life, there could be some fool who is blindfolded and runs across the street, and he gets to the other side, and he's got a better standard of living than you, and he got the job ahead of you and everything. But like, he got lucky that he wasn't taken out along the way. Okay. The answer is that we use sensory information to mitigate our risks and reduce exposure to extreme shocks. So although some other people might be lucky, or some other organizations, maybe they have this legacy of hundreds of years of goodwill at their disposal. McKinsey and Company, are they better than Miltton? Probably not. BCG, whatever, these like legacy organizations, they might get the biggest clients, the best deals, but they are largely, I can't speak with authority on this, but I would say maybe they're free riding a little bit off great reputations or just being the biggest, baddest guys. Are they necessarily fully, blindfold off looking at the world as much as you? I hope that analogy made a little bit of sense.
No, I know.
This is, Steve Jobs' quote, which is repurposed for anti-fragility. Eliminating obvious downsides like bad habits and debts, write a good life. But eliminating good things as well, so you can focus on the very best, will lead to a truly flourishing life. This notion of addition via subtraction, thinking about, improving. That's the whole point of anti-fragility, improving from disorder. If you're a smoker, what's the best thing you can do to improve your health? Quit smoking, remove something. So get better by removing something. Paradoxically enough, we maybe don't need to eat 3 meals a day, right? As much as it's nice to eat 3 meals a day. Paradoxically, lying in bed, doing absolutely nothing, experiencing no risk, no damage to the body, is one of the least healthy things you can do. That's like an interesting, just dichotomy of life. How is that so? How is it that we're built that we will only improve from disorder necessarily? And then how might that look in an organizational level? How might that look at your individual relationships levels? Like people say communication is the key to a good relationship. Yeah, sure. Like addressing things that are tough and hard, going through what is the conversation you want to always put off. You become stronger from that. And that's professionally, and that's also, interpersonally as well. So I love this idea of via negativa, addition via subtraction. You can think about it in many. And this is a photo of 3 candles. But the quote behind them, I think, is one of the most just crisp, pure, beautiful bits of writing from Taleb. And think about it in the context of what we've just said, or what I've just said with anti-fragile. Wind can extinguish a candle, but energize a flame. That same breath of wind, which will knock this out because it hasn't improved, it hasn't become a bigger fire, it hasn't experienced, now it's a candle. Just take a small fire, big fire. It hasn't had all the wood thrown onto it. It hasn't gone through the human example, like the It hasn't stayed healthy. It hasn't maintained good relationships. It hasn't prioritized financial independence. It's exposed to big downsides. And this gust of wind comes along, and it's done. It's gone. The fire's done. You've blown up in financial terms. On this side, though, the fire was a little bit bigger. The health was prioritized. Hard conversations prioritized. Did the hard thing to maybe deliver a little bit better at work. Try to deliver a little bit of a better standard of living. The fire's a little bit better. And that same gust of wind, which can blow something up, can energize something else. And this is the idea of the randomness. That's the gust of wind. Completely random event. The black swan, perhaps, benefiting from it rather than perishing from it. Finally, 11:15, I'm going to quickly go through. And I realize that I'm sort of just talking it. Maybe it's not so linear. I hope you are a little bit entertained. So of the 5 books I mentioned, the 3 most well-known, Black Swan, Anti-Fragility, Skin in the Game. We know what skin in the game is. It's a euphemism for accountability. That saying is in English at least. Actually, I wonder, this is a saying in Swedish as well? No, it's not a saying in Swedish.
No.
You know what it means. That makes sense, right?
Yes.
For sure.
No, go for skin in the game.
Skin in the game. Well, skin in the game is to have a literal piece of you exposed in your decisions. You're accountable for your decisions. You might reap a ridiculous upside, but should that decision go wrong, you must be accountable for the downside. This is an ancient notion. In the book, he talks about Hammurabi's law. 4000 BC Mesopotamia. In the center of town stood a pillar where they had the laws of society written onto it. This is where an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth comes from. In ancient Mesopotamia, I'm just like, this is an ancient. It's such important glue for a society, because the minute we're not accountable for our downside, the worst part of our nature will try to get away with more and more and more and more. We see this. I mean, you can look at Swedish society. I'm sure you can look inside your own organization. You can look in your own interpersonal relationships with people. If you know you can get away with something, you're more likely to push the edges. And then if you're, really going to go for it, like the Bob Rubin trade, which I'll get to, you can. Yeah. So in ancient Mesopotamia, one of the laws of society was that an architect, the construction, very high status position in society. This is 4000 BC. So if you can build stuff, you're an extremely valuable person. If the house collapsed and people in that house died because of the fault of the architect, that architect and his family, corresponding to the people that died in the house, would be put to death. It's complete accountability for your actions. Now, thankfully, we don't have as severe accountability heuristics these days, but the enforcement of the law is an idea of skin in the game. But I mean, you think about this in the context of consulting firms. Taleb speaks in largely cynical language when he speaks about consultancy, because in his eyes, and I will say clearly they're not my opinion, but in his eyes, you're not accountable for your actions. You might recommend a procedure, get the paycheck, back onto the next client. What if your recommendations actually resulted in, your recommendation was to go into this market, turns out this market was a complete waste of money. Do you then come back, return your check, and say, oh, we're actually also going to compensate you for the downside? No, you don't. No, you shouldn't either, because it's understood what the value of the consultancy is going to be. Maybe they're using many consultants, they understand. Anyway, nonetheless, but that's because of that dichotomy. Nassim does speak about different professions with a notion of having accountability for decisions, what you do, your actions, so forth. Okay.
I was thinking a lot about this when it comes to political commentators.
Absolutely.
In the news.
Absolutely.
I think that will be like a good example, like a program that was like, I think it was a week before Russia invaded Ukraine. There was 2 like senior political analysts on a news channel saying, no, it's not going to happen because of 1, 2, 3, 4. Yep. And then the week after, Putin invaded Ukraine. And then the same commentators, political analysts, came to the news and they were like, yeah, one of them were like, yeah, I know, I admit that I made a mistake, but here's how I can explain how I made a mistake. And the other one was like, he didn't even take that responsibility. He was like, yeah, I know that I said that Putin will not invade Ukraine. And in my opinion, this is not a real invasion. So that's so anyway, zero skin in the game there.
100%, without a doubt, and that's it's so clear when people right up the top are not accountable for the decisions that they make. And again, like there are measures of society, maybe they shouldn't be. If you are the president of a country that decides to send your people off to war, should you then also be there fighting? No. In the old days, yes, absolutely. The generals took the most risk and they had the highest status in society because of it. But these days it's less so. But 100%, we will listen to the same political voice, or the same commentator that will say with absolute authority that one thing is going to happen, and then it doesn't happen, and they don't lose all their credibility.
Yes.
When if it worked properly, they would lose their credibility, or at least a bit of their credibility.
Yeah.
And I suppose it's like a consequence of something else. The fact that we as consumers will still consume these things. We're not sending the right signals into the market as to how we want it to behave, because in truth, we don't want boring middle of the line commentary that's always safe and always hedging its bets and always reporting exactly the news. In Australia, SBS is the state news channel, and we also have private media, like contrary to Sweden. You have some, but not really. And no one watches it. No one watches it, although it is the absolute best news if you want to be informed. But it's boring and it's unentertaining, and so no one watches it. And I think Sweden's got a great setup because of SVT is entertaining as much as news really can be, but it's also, in my estimation, pretty run down the middle, straight line. I don't know, maybe you have your own political bias to attach onto it, but I would say so. Compare it to the American system or the United Kingdom system, where you're coming in for a political opinion. You're not coming in for what the news of the day is. And with Noam Chomsky being invited back on a podcast, put Jordan Peterson in the same light. They're entertaining people. And for these reasons, like, they're going to come back and back again, even though, but the problem is us as consumers are not sending the right signals back. If we wanted them to be accountable for the downside, we'd stop listening to them and we'd maybe ask them to be accountable, but unfortunately we don't. But that is obviously another topic, but 100% it comes back to this notion of being accountable for your decision. It's a euphemism for accountability, having skin in the game. And again, like much of the other stuff, it can be extrapolated all the way down to interpersonal relationships, all the way up to how we interact with our government. Bob Rubin trade. So one must own their risk. In 2007, the mortgage crisis kicked off in America and trailed on from there a global economic downturn. Very few countries escaped recession. What happened? In the 7 to 8 years before it, there were a number of financial firms taking extremely risky bets. And in those extremely risky bets, they were receiving a lot of upside. They were being very well compensated. This guy, Robert Rubin, made $120 million alone in, I think, 2 years before GFC, right? This is, I forget it, I should have written it down. I forget his exact position. He's now in government, right? So no accountability whatsoever. But because of the acts of Bob Rubin and hundreds, potentially thousands of other very, very savvy financial traders, they leveraged up risks to the point where, as we all know, the market crashed. Now, when the market crashed, it was the taxpayer, people completely ignorant and certainly not involved financially in the decisions that led up to the crash, who ended up, through their tax money, bailing out the banks. If there was skin in the game, these traders not only would have had to have returned the money they made, they would have gone out of business and they would have gone bankrupt, because all of the rest of the money they had would have been paid back into the system to try and account for the asymmetry that's happened there. So the bankers privatized the upside and socialized the downside. Zero skin in the game. They were not accountable for the risks that they took.
I got a question about his investment. He had this black swan strategy when he invests. Is he very wealthy now, or?
Yeah. So
yeah, it paid off to have this black swan.
Yeah.
Strategy.
Yeah. He talks about it as the Barbell strategy. He'd have 5 to 10% of his assets at any given time exposed to extremely risky high upside events like the downturn of the market, and the rest of his money in the most boring investment possible, which is US bonds. So he was safe with the absolute majority of his money and exposed himself to make the big upside on the other events. I'm not sure what his net worth is, but he made FU money that he talks about, and that's why he retired and just writes books now and is a Twitter bot, maniacing on everyone.
Yeah, in terms of what we do, that sometimes like marketing campaigns. So a black swan example can be campaigns with a little bit of a shock value in the content that creates some polarization in the market. But in the long run, we'll see that how the future of the market was actually influenced by that polarization created by that campaign with a bit of a shock value. Now, regardless of like how one can see this in ethical terms, but this is something that has been applied. I'm not sure if we have done it, but this has been applied in the market throughout the years.
Can you think of an example?
I think when I read Ryan Holiday's book, Trust Me, I'm Lying. So he wrote a book that was about his experiences as a shock value marketer. And then he said, no, I don't want to continue that life anymore. So he invested in other things. He became like a self-help guru there. But he wanted to market a film, a very like low budget indie film that one of his friends created. He created this like a billboard with a very polarizing message. I'm not sure what it was, but that actually led to that that low budget indie film becoming like the bestseller because everybody wanted to see it through that. Yeah,
it's cool. And like you said, how that shock value might then be normalized into everyone else's marketing campaign. That theme of survivorship bias is rich throughout all the 5 books. I mean, as you well know, the part of noticing the randomness is also realizing the biases. Where is survivorship bias, and why is something taken at face value when it's just the result of copying iterations for so long in a certain film?
Right. So how do you like for us that we usually look at the past data and we build some predictive models to predict the future of the data? Do you think there is a way to take into account these types of topics like black swan and accommodating a degree of randomness and the future outcomes of these randomness into our work? Is it something that you think
that's, I mean,
consulting firm that has focus on customer analysis?
Yeah, look,
needs to consider.
Yeah, if I could confidently answer that question, I'd have my own billion-dollar firm. So I don't think that's the case that I could recommend something. But to think about it is 100% worthwhile. And noticing, for instance, in your past data, where is the noise? What can you just dismiss as being a waste of time, or bad variables that's going to, and maybe get rid of predictive models altogether? But I know you can't. Like, there's a great anecdote in there about firms consulting their clients and offering as a heuristic to the investment. This is in oil and gas. A huge part of the financing is going to come off to, well, what's the price of oil going to be in 2 years? We don't know the price of oil tomorrow morning, So in this case, that heuristic is absolutely worthless. In fact, it's worse than worthless. It damages the model because you don't know what the price of oil is going to be. In 2019, they had zero, absolutely no one. There was no trader in the world who would have mapped the history of oil since 2019, for example. Yes, there would have been hundreds of firms out there that relied on the price of oil and the future heuristic as a very important variable to the investment money that they're taking, as you all well know. So I don't know, to be honest. But to think about it, this is probably the answer.
I would make an assumption about a coming black swan. You have some historic data that we look at. I mean, that happened, but like the pandemic, that was a black swan, I guess. I mean, but it destroyed a lot of data. I mean, we have historic data we basically can't use because it's not relevant for the current time.
Yeah. How can you predict the future of infinite possibilities based off a finite experience of the past? Like even looking at what previous black swans might have been is also, next to useless. Because we don't know what it's going to be.
In their nature, that's something different, something new.
Exactly. It's exactly in the nature of it. Taleb actually speaks specifically about COVID, and I don't know if how much of this is him being a shock jock or not, him just wanting to get attention. But he said COVID actually wasn't a black swan because we had for the longest time, we've known that the risk of a pandemic, or at least a highly contagious virus, is possible. We didn't create the right systems and barriers to somehow isolate and prevent them and so forth. What Bill Gates spoke about in his latest TED Talk, I don't know if you've seen, it's like a model for how we can police viruses in the future. But for example, if tomorrow we're in this room, we mutated the COVID virus into a 50% mortality, that's a huge black swan, clearly. I mean, but it's, the mutation going from what it is to something completely unthinkable, that is the black swan. I don't know if that helps.
Talking about predictive modeling or things that we do, like predicting in the future, I mean, it becomes too narrow, and there's what you can open up a little bit, so you can. Sometimes we talk about adding a little bit of randomness into it, so we actually get new data when the models keep updating. So you don't just do historical, nice little lying on the couch thing, or the same way crossing the road, or the same way. You can actually take different paths to cross the road. So we add a little bit of openness into the outcomes and allow new information to come in. You're more open to, if maybe not the big black swan, but if the little hatchlings comes around and this.
Yeah, exactly what you just described is the process of becoming more anti-fragile, doing the new thing, exposing the downside of the new thing. You take the new road, you add a new variables. Oh, that didn't work out. Well, now we know not to do it. So 100%.
I mean, crossing the street and then suddenly you see different type of car coming there, not the usual ones driving past. You get to be a little bit wary. Strange. But wait a bit. Then I cross.
Yeah.
You the minority rule.
Yeah.
Can we just have a very
yes, absolutely.
That is also
absolutely. This is a really interesting one. I skipped over it because I was not sure I was relevant to you guys, but I'm sure you'll be able to map it onto your own lives. I was recently listening to Malcolm Turnbull's autobiography. He's an Australian former Prime Minister. He was kicked out of his own party. And as I was listening to it, I was like, bang, this is Taleb's minority rule at play in real life. The minority rule is when an intransigent minority, 3 to 4% of the population, their immovability on a topic will sway the behavior of the other 96% who are kind of movable to it. Examples: peanuts. You can't have peanuts in schools, even though only a minority are allergic to peanuts, because that's an immovable variable for the minority and a movable variable for the majority. So peanuts are now in schools, they can't be in airplanes. Kosher, if you look at most soft drinks, they're kosher, even though how many people in this room are kosher, right? The kosher is the people that demand that it be kosher is an absolute minority, but it was cheaper for the manufacturers to just create both rather than one of each, because it doesn't make a difference to us. So all soft drinks are kosher. I really want to get this right because it is a fascinating one. What happened to Malcolm Turnbull was he was on the Conservative Party in Australia, And there were a few people and he was pro climate change. And there were a few people in his party who I think,
pro climate.
as in he believes it. He believes it.
Yeah, he wants it.
Yeah, exactly. He had a lot of policy of Australia spending shitloads of money to change their energy because we're one of the per capita one of the highest carbon emitting countries in the world. It's embarrassing. We shouldn't be. We have sorry for swearing. We have loads of natural resources, natural gas, access to more solar than any other country. Yet nonetheless, we import most of our oil. It's really silly. Anyway, in his party, there was a absolute immovable minority who were completely against Turnbull's climate change policy. And they were willing to, and because they were immovable, they were willing to convince the rest of the party that could be moved on it to change their policy as well and kick Turnbull out. It's just an example of an immovable minority overpowering a movable majority. Can you think about minority rule elsewhere?
Sorry?
Can you think of the minority
Yes,
rule?
and the reason that I brought it up, we have like 7 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Was from an old colleague, Arvid, was explaining one day that he said like, I'm not a vegetarian, but I happen to eat mostly vegetarian food. And then I asked why, and I said, my daughter is vegetarian. So we just started in the family, and I started by cooking more vegetarian for her. Before we knew it became a thing. Now all of us are actually becoming vegetarian. And that was the time that I was reading one of Taleb's books, which was explaining the minority rule when it comes to vegetarian. So the example that he gave was the kosher food. That it starts with someone that truly believes in it. But because the vegetarian people and vegans, they actually believe that they are like more like believing people. They're confident in what they believe. And so they're more assertive and say, this is what I believe. And this culture can spread much faster when it comes to a minority that are confident that they believe in something. An example of this was like the Bolsheviks during the October Revolution, because they were in the minority, but they actually believed in something, and that spread and became the majority rule in the long run. So that was interesting that Arvid said something that I was actually just reading about.
Halal meat in the UK, another great example.
Yeah.
Simply just because it's too expensive to create two different types of meat. And there was significant enough of an immovable minority that now in many, many places throughout the UK, you're just going to by default be served halal meat.
Yeah.
In political parties, I had examples, but I can't. My website is now too slow to load, apparently, which is not good. But think about as an example for why both left and right are now largely extreme and there's way less center.
Yeah.
The minority on the hard left and the hard right are immovable in their positions to the point where the rest of the behavior of people in that party just succumb to it, and because they're movable, So in much better language, Taleb describes it.
Yeah. Was it anything else, Ryan? Or
No, that was all. That was all from me.
Yes.
Really interesting
Yeah,
session.
very good.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Okay, amazing.
Yeah.